Chapter 20, Laboratory Assessment of Human Performance. We're getting into some theories and some ethical issues surrounding laboratory tests for physical performance. First off, let's look at physical performance itself. It's the capacity for maximal energy output, and that can either be anaerobic or aerobic. And all the three systems, the major systems that we talked about that produce ATP, which would be the ATP PCR system or the phosphagen system, otherwise known as the anaerobic glycolysis, and also aerobic system. Also, you can test for muscular strength and endurance. So actually testing the strength and endurance of the muscles, and the strength is just the amount or the maximal force that a muscle or muscle group can produce through either one or maybe a few, a low amount of reps. Then endurance is that sustained muscular contraction without fatiguing. Now, for the laboratory tests, they should stress the same physiological systems required by sport. This is known as the principle of specificity or specific adaptation to imposed demand. So whatever system that you're using during that sport or competition that someone is training for, that's the one that should be trained. That's the one that should be tested as well. All right, so if you're testing a long distance runner, say a marathon runner or a cross country runner, you're not going to put them on a bench press and test their bench. That's not going to necessarily be the same physiological system that they're actually using during the sport. It would be more apt to, you would benefit more by obviously testing their VO2 max on a treadmill. And again, even the specifics of that, it should be on a treadmill versus a cycle ergometer. Now, someone who is training maybe for the Tour de France, then yes, you put them on a cycle ergometer because that's going to be more specific to their sport or activity. Also, the athletes should volunteer for the testing. Doesn't necessarily mean this is always the case. Because you get into some team sports, obviously there's going to be coaches or strength and conditioning coaches that are going to test them throughout the season. Doesn't necessarily mean they need to absolutely volunteer, but they should be willing to do it at least. Also, they should be aware of the potential risks that are involved. Muscle strains, any tears that could possibly happen. As well as if you're testing them and you're trying to have a little bit more invasive testing, such as maybe muscle biopsies or blood draws, they need to be aware of some problems that could go along with that as well. Let's look at the factors that are contributing to physical performance. So we have performance here in the middle, and we have all these things that are affecting performance. So we've discussed environment and how that could affect an individual in either VO2 max, maybe even affect anaerobic type of exercise as well in a hot environment or humidity being high, and as well as going up to altitude. And some psychological factors, and we've seen that in chapter 19, we have the central fatigue theory and maybe some overtraining issues, staleness, maybe some burnout of the activity. Then we have the energy output, which going into that, which would be aerobic and anaerobic systems. Again, the three main systems to produce ATP. And strength, all right, that is related again to muscular contraction. And then we have coordination and economy. Some of that is going to go towards genetics, towards training, specific coaching, and good coaching will help to improve the economy of the movements that someone is performing. So these all affect performance. And again, they could negatively affect or positively affect performance depending on what the factors, how they're contributing to the activity. Now, the strengths and weaknesses, this can serve as a baseline for data to plan the training. You can get a good idea of where the strengths are and the weaknesses are of a certain athlete and determine where they're starting from. And not only that, you can train them or test them throughout the season and throughout different periods of the competition and determine, Are they gaining strength? Are they gaining endurance? Are they gaining aerobic capacity? And from there, you can tailor the program to that individual then. So again, it provides feedback regarding the effectiveness of the training throughout the entire training process. Also, it can provide some education about the physiology of the exercise. Some athletes may or may not be educated on why exactly the testing is done and why specific tests are done versus other tests, and maybe why someone is or is being tested on a treadmill versus a bicycle. Maybe why they do a bench press instead of a squat. All these various tests, and it is good to explain to the athlete, to the person that you're testing, why you're doing that. Why are we doing this test versus another test? And what's the physiology behind it? And why is it important? And why does it correlate well to that athlete's sport? Now, a couple things to keep in mind. It's difficult to simulate sports in a laboratory. Most of the time, laboratories, they're going to be controlled settings. They can mimic the sports fairly well, but it's still going to be difficult to actually get out there into the field or on a basketball court and completely mimic exactly what's going on during the activity or during the competition. So there's some physiological and psychological demands that are specific to the sport that really can only be looked at if somebody's actually playing that sport, actually participating in that activity. Now, we can go into the laboratory and start to isolate some of those physiological and psychological demands, but it's tough to bring them all together and determine a good test for all of those all at once. It's also difficult to predict performance just from a single test. You have to test them over and over and over again. So the performance in the field is going to be really the ultimate test. You can test someone on for VO2 max, and their VO2 max could be extremely high, but then they get out into the field and they start running that cross country event, or they start running that cycle competition, or cycling that cycling competition. Excuse me. And they could perform poorly when somebody else doesn't have as high a VO2 and perform much better. So there's some things that go on there, and that could just be psychological, or there could be something physiological going on there of why one is performing better than the other, even though that's not the way it should be on paper, basically from the laboratory tests. All right, effective physiological testing. So the variables should be relevant to the sport. We've talked about that. The specificity of the testing to the actual sport itself. They should be valid and reliable. All right, they should basically test what they're supposed to test, and you should be able to get consistent results from that and accurate results. They should, again, be sport specific. We've talked about that. And the tests should also be repeated at regular intervals. It's not going to help you all that much if you just test someone once at the beginning of the season, then never test them again. If you test them at certain intervals, it could be every week, every couple weeks, every month, every couple months. You're better able to get an understanding of how well the training is actually working and how much they're improving, or maybe they're at a plateau, or maybe they're decreasing their performance. They should also be carefully controlled. And going back to the laboratory, they are usually controlled. That way you can exclude any erroneous variables. You try not to bring in a lot of stuff, maybe like environmental factors like wind, even though sometimes you might want to include that, certain types of wind. But even if you're including wind, say it's maybe like a shooting competition or something like that, where wind can play a huge role, you still want to control that wind. You want to make it either 5 mile an hour or 10 mile an hour and come up from a certain direction. And normally you'd probably have fans blowing or some type of turbines, something like that. So you still want to even control some of the erroneous variables that might be seen out in the field. You still want to try to control those in the laboratory. And they should also be interpreted to the coach and the athlete. Everyone should have the disclosure of knowing exactly what these tests mean and how they are going to correlate to the activity and to the sport, and also the data from the different testing sessions and how much they're improving or how much they're not improving, and what they might need to do to increase their performance. And going back to the reliability, the results must be reliable. They can't just be all over the board and you're not really sure if it's accurate or not. One way to increase reliability is use experienced athletes. Use somebody who is really well trained in that specific testing protocol, either be strength or muscular endurance or aerobic endurance. Higher or experienced athletes tend to be a little bit more motivated. The elite athletes, they understand what it takes to push themselves a little bit further than maybe novice athletes or sedentary individuals, and they're better able to pace themselves without fatiguing quickly. Also, experienced athletes, if you have a test where you want them to go to exhaustion, most experienced athletes and really well-trained athletes know exactly what volitional exhaustion means. It means that they go until they absolutely cannot go any further. Sedentary individuals tend to stop sooner just because of the discomfort. They're not able to get past that discomfort phase of becoming fatigued and maybe a little bit of pain and soreness and just overall body discomfort along with physical training. So more experienced athletes tend to be better subjects when tested, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't use untrained individuals. They're an important part of it. Now, the equipment must be calibrated. You can't have anything that's going wrong with the equipment itself. It needs to be repeatable data, and it needs to be accurate, so that any power output must be reproducible for each training session. So again, it must be calibrated to the specifications. And again, the test should mimic the event. We've discussed this before, such as cyclists need to be tested on a cycle ergometer, and people who are runners need to be tested on a treadmill. All right, looking at maximal aerobic power. So VO2 max testing. The most accurate way of getting an accurate measurement of aerobic capacity is going to be direct testing in the laboratory. This is through open circuit spirometry, and this is known as a metabolic cart, where they are breathing a known gas, breathing in the air, and they're exhaling into a machine that is going to analyze that air and spit out a bunch of numbers very quickly, within just a few seconds, of what they're, how much oxygen they are using, how much carbon dioxide they are producing, and from those numbers we can get how much carbohydrates they're using, fats that they're using, and again, this is the best way to determine VO2 max. There are other ways to estimate it based on heart rate. There are cycle tests known as the YMCA test, where you go up different stages and you just kind of extrapolate from what the heart rate was at those few stages, and you can estimate VO2. There's also a walk test. There's a couple of different step tests that you can perform. But again, those are estimates. The benefit with those estimates, though, is that they are cheap for the most part. You really don't, you need a heart rate monitor, or actually you don't even need a heart rate monitor. You can palpate the wrist and determine the heart rate from there. But if you had a heart rate monitor, you're into it, maybe if you get a really good one, maybe $75, $100, and you'll need a stopwatch and some type of step if you're doing the step test, or need to be able to be at least on a track. All right. So it's minimal equipment that's needed for that. For the open circuit spirometry or the metabolic cart, you're talking thousands, tens of thousands of dollars for a specialized piece of equipment, and it's not very portable. It's going to be confined to the laboratory. And again, with this same one, the specificity of testing, it needs to be specific to the athlete sport. Now, when looking at a VO2 max, if you put someone on a metabolic cart, you know when they have reached max. Sometimes they might stop before they've reached this point up here, this point of plateau. But you know that they've reached the true max when Each of these dots represents a different stage. You're going up in intensity, and in this case, it's represented as work rate or watts. So the oxygen uptake is obviously increasing as you're going up in work rate. And once they get to a certain point of this wattage, looking at approximately 250, the next stage, they've increased the wattage, the intensity of the exercise, but they have not increased the oxygen uptake. And the same thing with the last stage here. There really isn't much of an increase. There's more of a plateau at this phase. So they know that at this point, this was the maximal oxygen uptake. You could go maybe a little bit higher towards the end of it, but that's not going to be representative of your true max. Your true max is going to be once you increase the intensity of the exercise and you've seen a plateau or possibly a decrease in oxygen uptake, then you know that somebody has reached their maximal oxygen uptake. Our endurance performance testing. You could look at peak running velocity, and this would be the highest speeds that somebody can maintain for greater than 5 seconds. And you're looking really at how well they're able to buffer out the lactate or the decrease in the pH that's occurring. So looking at the lactate threshold, then again, this is the exercise intensity at which the blood lactate begins to increase at a really rapid pace. We'll see a figure here in a second. Normally, the lactate threshold is expressed as a percentage of VO2. Somebody can exercise at 75% of their VO2, and that's their lactate threshold, is 75% of their VO2. You could do a direct measurement where you're actually taking blood samples and figuring out their lactate at certain points during an exercise test and determining where that point is where they start to increase their blood lactate at an exponential rate. Or you could estimate it by ventilatory threshold, and we'll see a figure here in a second. So the lactate threshold, getting back to it, is it estimates maximal steady state running speed. Essentially, the higher the lactate threshold, the greater the intensity somebody can work at for a longer period of time without fatiguing. So, which is obviously beneficial when you're running a race and you need to be at a high speed for a very long period of time. This tends to be a better predictor of success in long distance running events, or even cycling or rowing, perhaps. It tends to be a better predictor than just VO2 itself. Now, you have to have the VO2, but you also need to have a high lactate threshold, be able to buffer out those hydrogen ions to be able to increase your intensity for a long period of time without fatiguing. Now, the prediction of it then is by the ventilatory alterations and looking at the ventilatory threshold. This is the point where there's going to be a really rapid increase in ventilation versus your oxygen uptake. And you can use this to estimate the lactate threshold. And the graph is going to look fairly similar to the lactate threshold. And a lot of researchers will actually use the ventilatory threshold to estimate the lactate threshold. So looking at the lactate threshold, you can see the oxygen uptake versus the blood lactate accumulation. And we have this increase in blood lactate, but during this part of the exercise, the individual is able to buffer it out at a good pace. It's even though it's increasing, but once they get to a certain point, you can see how it increases significantly. There's a very sharp, there's a steep climb in the blood lactate. So this point right here, this last point where it right before it starts to increase, that is the lactate threshold. And wherever this was in terms of the VO2 max, you can take that percentage of where it occurred in VO2 max, and that would be your lactate threshold. Now, the ventilatory threshold, again, looks fairly similar, where we have oxygen uptake and we have expired ventilation, the amount that we're actually expiring through exercise, and we have this more rapid increase at a certain point. And this tends to correlate fairly well with the lactate threshold. And what's going on is that we're increasing ventilation because we're starting to get that acidity build up in those hydrogen ions, and we're starting to get lactate build up, and we're trying to buffer them out at a more rapid pace, and we're trying to exhale a lot of carbon dioxide, and we're also we're basically trying to get rid of a lot of waste that's building up in the system. So that's the point where the fatigue is going to set in really quickly. Looking at young athletes, so laboratory testing to predict future success. This is going to be a little bit difficult to do. One thing you could do is you could look at both parents. Really, you could just look at them and say, and just ask them, what have you done? What sports have you partaken in? Your VO2s, maximal strength and endurance. From a physiological standpoint, you could actually look at the muscle biopsies and determine what fiber types that individual possesses more than maybe another, or maybe they're just all equal. And from there, you can determine, maybe you can start to make predictions. This person's going to be more anaerobic type of athlete. They might be a better high jumper or long jumper versus a cyclist, or they might be better at football versus maybe a 1 mile runner. All right. So you can look at that and make fairly decent estimates of where they might perform better. But there's no true laboratory test that's going to predict at a very high accuracy ability, ultimate ability of where they would be in the future. A lot of that's going to be dependent on training. Now, genetics makes up a big part of where they can get to, but training is going to play a major role, and also motivation as well. What sports do they like, and what sports don't they like? So there's other factors that can't really be measured at that are important, such as some physiological factors. And especially being a young individual, it's going to be tough to determine, what your VO2 is going to be in 5 years. Again, a lot of that's going to be dependent on training, and you can test them at given periods of time and start to see a trend, but it's still going to be tough to predict exactly where they're going to be. But it can provide feedback, obviously, for young athletes, and it might even be some motivation for them. They could maybe find out that, wow, I naturally maybe have a higher VO2, or maybe I have a naturally high amount of type 1 muscle fiber. So I really want to go into long distance running, and I like running. All right. So it could actually help motivate them a little bit. It could show them the strengths and weaknesses in their sport that they're playing or want to play. Also, the effectiveness of any type of conditioning program that they have as well. All right, turning the tables here and going to anaerobic power. So you're trying to test the energy pathways, again, used in this event, and that would be the ATP PCR system as well as anaerobic glycolysis. For the ultra short-term tests, those jumping, maybe one jumps or maybe a long jump or strength, you're looking at the ATP PCR system. For a short-term test, that's the anaerobic glycolysis. And you can see the percentage of contribution for the energy systems on the y-axis, and we got time or maximal effort here in the x-axis. And you can see the ATP PCR provides a lot of ATP at the start, and then glycolysis obviously takes over at approximately 8-10 seconds, up to about 3 minutes. And then at 3 minutes, then the aerobic system is going to start to take over more and more and more of the ATP that's necessary for that activity then. So looking at the ultra short-term anaerobic power, so this, again, tests the phosphagen system, or also known as the ATP PCR system. So you can look at power tests, jumping, running. So that would be one jump or one or two jumps, and running would be sprinting type events. It's not going to be more than maybe get up to 100, maybe 200 meters. Now for football, a lot of times they'll use the 40-yard dash, or they might even use a shuttle run with very short recovery times in between there. And for soccer, again, you can use shuttle runs as well. You could also use cycling power tests for this. And we'll get into one here in a second. So the short-term anaerobic power, continuing on with this. So again, testing anaerobic glycolysis. For the cycling test, the gold standard would be the Wingate test, also known as the pedal and puke. It's a 30-second all-out sprint on a cycle ergometer. There's going to be a certain amount of weight and resistance on the flywheel. You can see, based on the subject's weight in kilograms, how much resistance there is on the flywheel. So again, it's an all-out sprint. I would encourage you to look up the Wingate test on YouTube and try to find a video of it. It's a really interesting test. If you've ever performed it, you kind of know that what goes into it. The first 5 or 10 seconds, man, you feel really good about it. You're gonna do really well, and your legs are moving pretty quickly. And then somewhere around 10 to 15 seconds, you start to slow down. And about the last 5 seconds, you feel like your legs are gonna turn to jello. But it's a really fun test, and it's a really accurate test of determining peak power for the ATP PC system, as well as anaerobic glycolysis. You could also do some running tests, some maximal running tests at 200 to 800 meters also. And again, they need to be sport specific. I've stressed that throughout the chapter. Everything needs to be sport specific. Now, looking at muscular strength, you could do isometric measurements. This is static force using some type of tensiometer. And the isometric force muscular contraction is where there is muscular contraction, so there's cross-bridging of myosin actin, but there's no lengthening or shortening. If you put your hands together and push them, there's going to be equal and opposite forces. The muscles are contracted in your arms and in your chest, but there's no movement. All right, so there's no lengthening or shortening of the muscles. You could also do free weight testing. So using some type of weights, either dumbbell or barbell, and the weight is actually remaining constant throughout. And how much you're able to lift for a 1RM is going to be determined by the weak point. And we'll get into that in chapter 21 a little bit. So for this, you could also use a dynamometer, a hand grip dynamometer. Also, isokinetic measurements. So this is actually variable resistance at a constant speed. So you're able to take advantage of maximal force contraction at different angles of the joint and just keeping the speed constant. And also variable resistance devices could also be used, such as chains, ropes, the strength bands have also been very popular lately, and also specialized machines can do this as well. So looking at isometric force, and this is of the knee extension. A lot of times you'll see it on a what's known as a Biodex, and this piece of equipment here is used in a lot of applications for research, but also rehabilitation purposes. And it's normally going to be hooked up to a computer, and we'll see a picture of it here in a second, hooked up to the computer. But it has a bunch of different attachments, either for legs or arms, and you can determine angular velocity, maximal force production, mean power, peak power, all that good stuff. That is going to be important in determining the strength capabilities, either isometric or isokinetic or even dynamic of the muscles, either in the leg or the arms. Here's a picture of the hand grip dynamometer, kind of the, I guess the man test. I don't know. When I was in grad school, we would always, or at least every once in a while, we would grab it and see who had the strongest grip. And we kind of had some fun with that. But basically you just grab onto it, and you have a scale that determines how much force that you're applying on the grip. And from there, you can determine hand grip strength. So here's the isokinetic assessment of knee extension. So you can hook this piece of equipment up, and this is hooked up to the ankle when you're determining the isokinetics of the isokinetic muscular contraction of the knee. So the speed is going to be remaining constant, but you can apply a maximal amount of force throughout the entire range of movement. And you can see it's hooked up to the computer. It gives you a nice output. And one of the outputs it'll give you is something similar to this, where you have the force that's being applied and we have the joint angle down here. Now you can see that the peak of the muscular force is going to be around 88 degrees. Right, so we have around 88 degrees in this exercise is where we're going to have the peak force production. That's going to be important with this type of piece of equipment, in that even though this was the peak force that you're able to apply, they were still able to apply the maximal amount of force throughout the entire range of motion. So at, say, 20 degrees, they were only able to apply 20 newtons, but that's the maximal amount of force they were able to apply and able to generate at 20 degrees. So you're able to, again, apply and generate maximal amount of force production throughout the entire range of movement. And we'll see in next chapter that when performing with free weights, there's going to be a weak point in the joint where that's going to determine your maximal amount that you're able to lift during that exercise. All right, that was chapter 20, laboratory assessment of human performance. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below, or you can email me if you want to. And I thank you for watching.